We've heard a lot of talk about from the fossil fuel industry about India needing our coal to there's energy poverty over there, and the argument is that we have a moral obligation to supply them now. So we got in touch with a scientist who's working in that area, Dr. Jonathan Balls, who's at the Australia-India Institute at Melbourne Uni. And we thought we'd get the truth, the real truth about what's happening, because energy systems in India is your specialty. Is that right, Jonathan?
Yeah, that's correct.
And Adani, who wants to build a huge mega coal mine in Queensland, is an Indian company, right?
Yes, that's correct. So it's based out of the state of Gujarat.
Tell us a bit about the work that you're doing over there, and if it's true, what's the current trend? Because we're hearing two ways. That one is that they need coal, and the other way is that renewables, wind, solar, are getting cheaper and cheaper, more accessible, and microgrids are becoming more and more popular over there.
Yeah. So my work is basically looking at what solar businesses have been doing in India over the last 10 years, and looking at some of the social enterprises that have been set up, where social enterprises are going into rural areas and selling solar products to villages where there's electricity is unreliable or not available. So that's basically what I've been focusing on in my own work, as well as looking at some of the politics around electricity distribution at a state level. So in terms of the question that you're asking about the situation in India, I guess the important background context to have is that over the last 20, 30 years, India's been going through this kind of really momentous effort to try and provide everybody with an electricity connection. So over the last 70 years, about 650,000 villages have been provided with an electricity connection. So just this year, India announced that the final village which didn't have an electricity connection now has been given an electricity connection. But there's still about 35 million households who don't have an electricity connection. So for a village to be counted officially as electrified, 10% of households have to have an electricity connection, but 90% of households don't necessarily. So there's that big challenge at the moment that's still of how you electrify 35 million households. And then the question of whether it's coal-based generation or whether it's renewables that's going to be the energy source that's going to be providing electricity to those people.
Yes, so what's the trend with whether it's coal or whether it's renewable energy?
So it's kind of a mixed picture. I mean, as you've been talking about, this kind of narrative is that India needs coal and it's going to need coal in the next 50 years in order to meet growing electricity supply. But the story isn't necessarily so straightforward about that. So if you look over the last 10 years, there's been a lot of coal-powered generation stations that have been built in India with this anticipation that there is going to be a need for coal-based electricity. But actually at the moment, a lot of them are only running at around 60-65% capacity, because the electricity companies are not buying their electricity because they don't have the demand for electricity to actually need that electricity, or because they don't have the money to buy that electricity because they're kind of financially struggling. So a lot of the coal-fired power stations that have been built to date already are really struggling to sell their electricity. So certainly in the short term, there's really not this clear picture that there is going to be a massive exponential growth in coal use. Whether that changes in the medium or longer term is kind of unclear and is likely to depend on how electricity consumption grows and how industrialization takes place and the cost of coal relative to renewables. But then also at the same time, the Indian government has really impressive targets for renewables. So the current government target is to install 225 gigawatts of renewable-based electricity by 2022, which is a really massive target. And they've made quite significant progress over the last few years in pushing forward renewables. In particular, it's wind power, but also on-grid solar power. So these kind of big solar parks where they develop a solar park in a kind of desert, unused land area and sell it into the grid. And I think, so last year they had the world's biggest solar park was commissioned in the state of Rajasthan, and the electricity tariff that was agreed for that solar park was at a rate that's actually cheaper than the rate that coal-based electricity is sold into the grid at. So this story of solar power being more expensive than coal-based power is kind of rapidly changing as the cost of solar power reduces. So looking forward, there's really a lot of uncertainty about whether coal is even going to be economically competitive against solar power, with the cost of solar power falling year by year,
Yep.
and the cost of solar power already kind of basically the same as coal generation electricity. Of course, there's still that issue of reliability and how you have those background reliability and the need for coal to kind of provide reliable 24-hour electricity. But obviously, as we all know, technology is changing rapidly, so it's not a very straightforward picture as to this exponential growth in coal use and whether that's going to take place, in my view at least.
Yeah. Do you see the market as being, like the price, as being the main indicator of which direction they go?
Yeah, I think that the price is a really important element, especially as solar's been kind of falling steadily year on year by around about 10% or so, I think, over the most recent years. Although that has stopped in the last year or two, the price hasn't seen such rapid falls. But it's kind of obvious that the price is on this downward trajectory that means that solar is increasingly competitive. And certainly in the areas so I have been working in the north of India, which has some of the biggest issues around lack of electricity and lack of electricity infrastructure in rural areas. And over the last 10 years, because of these falls in solar prices, this has opened up the opportunity for social enterprises and businesses to come in and, in the case of what I'm looking at, develop these kind of microgrids, solar-powered microgrids in rural areas where they provide a basic reliable electricity service for a kind of very cheap rate. So these are in areas where income is very, very low, where people might be spending maybe $1 a week on electricity. And so these kinds of companies will come in and provide a service where you might get several LED lights, the possibility to charge mobile phones, and maybe power some basic appliances. So already at the moment, these kind of technologies are at a price point where people are able to pay for them and are providing a kind of reliable service. And that seems certain that as we go forward in the coming years, that actually those technologies are only going to improve, and the chances are that they're going to play a really important role. So actually, the International Energy Agency, who look at the global picture of energy, in their latest report earlier in this year, they estimated that of the hundreds of millions of people who still don't have a reliable electricity connection around the world, they estimate that 1/3 of those people will be electrified with solar-based microgrids, or microgrids based upon other renewable-based generators. So that's kind of a really astonishing figure. The Indian government itself, recently in a draft paper, in terms of setting out their vision, they estimate that there could be a need for up to 10,000 solar microgrids in India in the coming years that will provide reliable electricity to rural areas where it's expensive for the grid to reach.
Yeah.
Kind of an alternative story to a coal-based development approach.
Exactly. And much more healthier for everyone as well, and the planet.
If we were sitting in the company called Adani, we should actually be a little bit worried, if not skeptical, about the business model?
Yeah, well, I mean, I've not really looked too carefully at the Adani business model. I can't claim to be an expert on that. But what I would say, in terms of the Australia-India relationship at least, is that, for example, here in Australia, we have really fantastic examples of experimentations taking place on smart grids, on decentralized microgrids, and ways of having much more flexible grids and enabling people to generate at a decentralized scale. And actually there's a huge opportunity for us to be engaging with India and collaborating with India on those kinds of technologies, and huge opportunity for that.
Yeah, export possibility.
The future.
Exactly. And Geelong, locally, where we are sitting, we have an export possibility because we are actually beginning to experiment with that. When I say we, it's Geelong Sustainability. This group is doing fantastic work, has connected about 200 residents or 200 families in something that could become sort of a virtual microgrid. The experiments are being made as we speak around Australia in that space. So you're so right. This is what we need to bring out to the world, not coal.
Yeah, I think also on that point, we have a lot to teach India in terms of what we've been doing here in Australia, but at the same time, India has a lot to teach Australia in terms of developing these systems, and there's really a huge opportunity for two-way learning and collaboration.
Yes.
I personally, obviously with this kind of wider context of climate change and the need for all of us to be transitioning away from fossil fuels, and arguably kind of a lack of activity in Australia on that front, there's a huge opportunity for us to be doing more in this area. And while we're all talking about coal on a day-to-day basis, we maybe should be talking about kind of our expertise and experimentation that we can be doing around decentralized energies, for example.
Exactly. And learning from what's happening in India.
That's a great note to end on. That'll be the ending of the Sustainable Hour today. Jonathan Balls, thank you very much there from the Australia-India Institute at Melbourne University. A great perspective to bring to Geelong. Thank you.
The Sustainable Hour,